When you see a team like Real Madrid get completely turned over by Manchester City in the semi-finals of the Champions League, it does raise the question about whether or not they should be doing something completely different on a football field. Now, everyone knows that Pep Guardiola and Carlo Ancelotti have very different ideas about what a football team should do. On the one hand, we have Pep Guardiola, who is the master of control, who has a plan for every phase of play, is really interested in the structure that his team use, and uses possession as a way of keeping the opposition off the ball. On the other hand, we have Carlo Ancelotti, who isn't too worried about control, who's happy to allow the opposition to have the ball for long stretches, but who's looking to generate situations where the quality of his players can produce these goal-scoring opportunities. And that is the dichotomy between Pep Guardiola and Carlo Ancelotti. Now, the important word here is control, because Pep Guardiola is going to use the collective positioning of his players in order to be able to control every phase of play. Now, on the board in front of me, I've got Manchester City as they set up in settled possession, and we all know exactly why Pep Guardiola does this. He has a front five that likes to stretch the opposition back line, create space to exploit, and then we have this deeper unit of five to be able to build the ball up, move it into the front five and generate chances. But this structure is actually really nicely set up in order for Manchester City to be able to control the ball as well, because we end up with these really nice units of four players in the wide areas consisting of the outside centre-back, the pivot player, the number 8 and the wide forward. And this gives you a lot of advantages to keep possession of the ball and control the game, because not only in this build-up phase do we have really nice access from the centre-back into the wide forward, but when the ball arrives with the wide forward, we can actually get 3 other players around him, which makes it much easier to overload against the opposition and retain possession and control. And in those situations, there may not be an immediate attacking option on, and if you need to, you can then recycle the ball back around, move it to the other side of the pitch, and you have actually the same unit of 4 players on the other side of the pitch as well. So this is a really nice structure, not only for moving the ball down the field, generating chances, but actually controlling possession of the ball as well. But Manchester City can also control games out of possession as well. So we've got a really nice example of this. Now, normally Manchester City will press out of a 4-4-2 shape when the opposition is trying to build up from the back. And we can see we've got Haaland and Kevin De Bruyne here, and then you would expect to have the other 4 midfielders all the way around here. But in this instance, what we can see is Jack Grealish here is going to do a really aggressive press against Eder Militao. He's going to bend his run so that he's going to force Courtois into this area of the pitch. And once he's done that, we can see that Manchester City have effectively split the pitch in half, and they've got their players really nicely set up to be able to go man-to-man against the Real Madrid players. We've even got Manuel Akanji here ready to jump up onto Dani Carvajal if the ball comes back the other way. But importantly, we can see that Jack Grealish has closed that passing angle off, so he's going to force Courtois even further across. But as you can see, the best option here for Courtois is actually playing the ball long to one of the Real Madrid forwards, but that's a really high-risk option, and more often than not, it's just going to result in a turnover of possession. And so Manchester City's out-of-possession structure has allowed them to regain possession of the ball and retain control of the game. But this is a far cry from Real Madrid, who really weren't able to control the ball in possession, and that shows up really nicely on this viz here, which shows that actually it took 25 minutes before Real Madrid could actually make a successful pass into the opposition half. But it's important to remember that Real Madrid aren't using possession to control the ball, they're using possession to generate dangerous chances. So let's take a look at the tactics board to see what it looks like. Now, we've already talked about how Manchester City use collective positioning in order to control space all the way across the pitch. Now, for Real Madrid, rather than occupying space across the whole pitch, what they're actually going to do is use much more localized structures in order to move the ball down the field. Now, the impetus behind this approach is that Real Madrid want to get their attacking players into the most dangerous positions possible. And when you have a player like Vinicius Jr., what you are going to try and do is get him isolated 1v1 against a fullback, get him into a foot race into space behind with that fullback, and then generate chances from there. And so the possession structure is designed to be able to create this sort of situation. So what you'll see is Real Madrid overloading certain areas. You may even see players like Rodrigo coming to help out, overloading on one side, and then what you'll see is these one-touch passes in this sort of area around the opposition, almost like a rondo, until you can get to a situation where the ball can be played in, that foot race can be done, Vinicius Jr. gets in behind and he can either go directly to goal, or he can play the ball back across to a teammate who can then score. And here's a really nice example from the Manchester City game itself. So we can see here Vinicius Jr. isolated 1v1 against Kyle Walker, and we can see that the rest of the Real Madrid team have moved across here to overload in this area. So you can see there's more Real Madrid players around the ball than Manchester City players. And so we've got Modric and Kroos here just pulling across onto the sideline, but also we've got Rodrigo, who's nominally playing on the right-hand side, coming across to help out. And what's going to happen is Modric is going to drop the ball back to Camavinga. Camavinga is going to play it forward to Rodrigo. And now you're in this really nice situation where Rodrigo can actually kickstart this 1v1 battle between Vinicius Jr. and Kyle Walker. And actually, in the end, Kyle Walker is able to defend it, but this is exactly what Real Madrid are trying to do. But it has a couple of problems involved with it. The first of these is that when you play in this way, you're actually relying on elite players players being able to do one-touch passing through actually quite a lot of pressure often. And what that means is that often you will end up turning the ball over, and if the opposition play their cards correctly, you can see there's lots of space for them to exploit. So it can be quite a dangerous way of playing to overload on one side. The second issue here is that because you're not possessing the ball in order to control the game, you're often giving up control to the opposition, so they will end up with the ball a lot more, and when the opposition has the ball more, they're actually able to generate more chances themselves. So what you do is you make a huge amount of pressure for these moments when you actually do have the ball to result in goals, and if not, then the opposition will largely be able to control the game as well. And Real Madrid also struggled out of possession, which isn't to say that they don't want to try and press aggressively and high. You can see from this screen grab here that actually there are plenty of Real Madrid players pushing forward when Manchester City are in their build-up phase. But the problem is that there's a lack of coherent identity in their pressing. And so we can see with Manchester City in their build-up phase, despite the fact that Real Madrid are pressing high and attempting to cause them problems in their build-up, there's so much of a disconnect between the forward unit of their press and the rest of their team that this huge space opens out between them. And because Manchester City have actually ended up with an overload here, because Gundogan has dropped out of the forward line to help in this build-up, all it takes is for Ruben Dias to bait Rodrigo towards him here, and he can pass the ball through to Gundogan into acres of space, and then Gundogan ends up ahead of the defender here with just the opposition back line and all of the City players looking to exploit the gaps in that back line. You can see Erling Haaland here ready to make that run, and Gundogan under very little pressure to actually make a good pass as well. So this leads to huge amounts of problems for Real Madrid out of possession as well. So despite the fact that Carlo Ancelotti's low control approach has clearly worked well for Real Madrid in the past, when your team loses in the manner in which Real Madrid lost to Manchester City, it does raise the question whether or not they need to move towards a much more control-based approach in their play. And so the question is, how do Real Madrid introduce those ideas about control into their game? And that is why Julian Nagelsmann is the perfect manager for Real Madrid, because on the spectrum between Carlo Ancelotti and Pep Guardiola, he sits right in the middle and introduces ideas from both of them. And that's what makes him so perfect, because on the one hand, he would still be able to use this squad in the same way that Carlo Ancelotti had been doing, getting all of those talented players around the ball and using localized ideas of structure. But he would also be a really good first step towards a more control-based approach. 2 years ago, Julian Nagelsmann was using ideas of positional structure with Bayern in order to be able to control games. On the board here, you can see a game between Bayern and Villarreal in the Champions League knockout stages, where Bayern's structure in possession looks very similar to what Manchester City are doing. As you can see, Bayern have the standard 5 attacking players just pulling the opposition back line apart, generating space that can be exploited. They have the narrow build-up structure as well, which gives you really nice access into those wide areas as well. And in those wide areas, we have these units of 4 players who are able to overload the opposition, possess the ball, and if needs be, recycle the ball around to the other side. So this is very much Manchester City football. But in the following season, Julian Nagelsmann wanted to do things in a very different way. So here's a screenshot from the first game of their season in the Super Cup versus RB Leipzig. And as you can see now, this is a very different sort of structure. Now we don't have that line of 5 Bayern forwards trying to stretch the opposition back line out to generate space. We actually have a much more localized idea of structure. So you can see outside of the back 4, all of the Bayern players are now in this much more central band. The idea being to generate much more dangerous chances through the interplay between these elite players with all of their technical ability. But that isn't to say that Julian Nagelsmann wants to throw all of these old ideas away. In fact, what he wants to do is use both of these approaches in tandem to get the upside from both of them. I've got a really nice quote here from Dani Olmo, which shows that. So Dani Olmo says, if we play more spaced out, we can't play as fast as the coach wants us to. That's why we want to play as close together as possible, almost like 5-a-side football. And so here we can see Julian Nagelsmann wanting to use these ideas of localized structure, the relationship between elite players in order to generate these dangerous chances. But that doesn't mean to say that he's thrown all the old ideas away, because as Dani Olmo goes on to say, if we succeed, we open bigger spaces and we're able to attack with more depth. So these localized structures are still designed with the intention of being able to generate space that can then be exploited. So Julian Nagelsmann can coach a team to have these ideas of control as the dominant principle, but he can also use these other ideas of localized space in order to be able to use his elite players to generate really quick and decisive attacks. But it isn't just in possession structure that Nagelsmann will have to fix. He'll also have to fix the out of possession structures. And this is where the problem lies, right? Because we all know that Galactico squads don't like to press. We've seen the troubles that the various PSG coaches have had trying to get Mbappe, Neymar and Messi pressing as a unit, and so we would expect to see the same problems here as well. But if we actually look at the Real Madrid squad going into next season, there's actually a remarkable lack of Galacticos-type players. Yes, we have got Benzema, Kroos and Modric, who are both consummate professionals. And beyond that, the younger players are actually really nice profiles for a manager who wants to introduce pressing. We've got Valverde, we've got Tchouaméni, we've got Camavinga. These are all players who are going to be really willing pressers out of possession. Which isn't to say that Julian Nagelsmann wouldn't have problems managing a dressing room, as we saw was the case when he was at Bayern Munich. But actually, if we look across this squad, there's actually loads of really good young players who would benefit from a Nagelsmann-type manager. And actually, if he could come in, implement his ideas and get Real Madrid winning, then probably a lot of those dressing room problems would go away. Now, according to reports coming out of Real Madrid, Carlo Ancelotti isn't going anywhere, but with Real Madrid faltering in the league and crashing spectacularly out of Europe, now might be the time for them to start moving towards this more control-based approach. And what better manager to start that process than Julian Nagelsmann? And the good news is, he's right there.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.